Okay, well, it's 12:30, so I think we'll get started. Um, I know we want to keep this at an hour. I know we're all really busy, so we'll get rolling here right away. I'll introduce myself, and then maybe I'll hand it over to you, Isabel. So my name is Neil Pettit. I teach at St. Clair College, the coordinator of professional development for teaching and learning there. So thank you, of course, to the U Windsor folks for kind of joining teams for this session is much appreciated. And thank you for fellow St. Clair College faculty for joining in on this session during this lunch hour. I'm also a U Windsor alumni. I don't want to miss that out. And graduated a few years ago now from the University Teaching Certificate Program, the fundamentals of university teaching. So definitely want to give that a plug here. Isabel, please go ahead.
Sure. Hi, my name is Isabel Brett-Ing, and I'm very new to Windsor, having just started in July, and I'm a professor and department head in integrative biology at the University of Windsor, and excited to be here and work with everyone and talk with everyone today about flipped learning.
And I'll just say a really quick word. I'm thrilled with this collaboration with the University of Windsor and St. Clair, and it was initiated by Neil. Neil, it was fantastic to hear from you, and we're thrilled that Isabel can share her extensive expertise. This is a workshop she's done nationally and internationally, actually, which is fantastic. And I did want to just mention to say thank you to everyone. As I mentioned, we're coming from different locations, but the University of Windsor itself sits on the traditional territory of the three confederacies of the First Nations, the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. And so we respect that long-standing relationship. And I'll just encourage that as you join, thank you, welcome. And we encourage interaction, but we would ask if you're not speaking, make sure to mute, and I will mute myself in a second. And then if you are speaking and you're able to get your camera to show, that you might show your camera and connect that way, but feel welcome to add into the chat or raise your hand. And welcome everyone. And I turn it over to Isabel and to Neil. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Erica. Okay, so let's get started with some outcomes. So the goal today is to be able, upon completion of the workshop today, to be able to conceptualize how a flipped classroom could be structured. We're going to identify when to best use technology to complement other course activities. And then the last point there, create a flipped lesson that includes online content, in-class activities, and a student assessment plan. So a lot of these activities we have built into the session today, and Isabel will be taking you through a lot of these great little sessions throughout. And you know, we do want to mention that we don't want to ignore the current situation that we're in, where we're emergency remote online teaching. So a lot of what we talk about does translate well to the online environment. But if you allow me to be optimistic here briefly, hopefully, maybe by the fall 2021, we'll be back in the classroom again and be able to take what we learned in this workshop and apply it in the physical classroom as well. So here's a quote from Honeycutt. So Barbie Honeycutt is she's a researcher in educational development. She has, I believe it's called Breaking Lectures podcast. It has a lot of really good resources out there. And this quote Isabel showed me, and it really spoke to me because I think of myself teaching, especially early on. And if I'm honest with myself, I still occasionally do this, where I think, what am I going to talk about today with my students? Well, when we talk about the flipped classroom, as the name implies, you want to kind of flip that thinking, right? So instead of thinking about what you're going to talk about today, think about what the students need to do to achieve the learning outcomes for this lesson. So it's a bit of a paradigm shift when we might think of the traditional classroom, quote unquote, of maybe giving a lecture, reading from slides. Compare that to what sort of participatory learning, lessons or activities that we want our students to do in order to learn the learning outcome. So an interesting quote there, and a lot of really good resources from Barbie Honeycutt So definitely, that's definitely a name to Google. Maybe we'll pass along some resources as well with that. So when it comes to the definition of the flipped classroom, so looking there on the slide, flipped learning is a pedagogical framework to facilitate meaningful student learning experiences using active learning strategies. So again, going back to that more traditional model where we may view ourselves as the experts and the students being empty vessels and we're just pouring our knowledge into them, well, it doesn't really work that way. We want our students actively learning and participating in that learning process. And that's what a flipped classroom, that's what we're aiming to achieve. We have interactive instruction, content exploration, and student collaboration while the classroom space is transformed into an interactive learning environment where the students work together and the instructor to apply their knowledge and test their assumptions. And Isabel, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, thank you. So Neil summed it up really well in terms of what flipped learning is. And I want to just emphasize one quick point before we go into this I want to share with you. And the thing I want to emphasize is that flipped learning is an example of active learning. It's not the only way to do active learning, but it's one of the ways in which you can introduce and implement different active learning strategies within your teaching practice. So I started flipped learning or implementing flipped learning within my teaching practice about 12 years ago. And I was teaching very large classes at the time. So I'm using flipped learning in classes that range anywhere from 400. And the reason that I did that is I was really finding that my students were not getting to that very deep learning that I wanted them. We're very good at memorizing information, writing very good exams, but then forgetting that and then having to kind of essentially relearn that all the time. So I thought, well, there's got to be a different way to my courses so that I can engage my students and work with my students a little differently. So I started working with Patrick Kelly at the University of Calgary, and I really want to acknowledge him here. We together developed a model, and FLIX stands for Centered Interactive Classroom Strategy. And essentially, FLIX is a sequential model that helps instructors create flipped lessons in their teaching practice. Flipped learning has become much more common over the last even 5 years as compared to what there's an increasing body of literature that supports the benefits of implementing flipped learning within your teaching practice. So what a lot of different studies have shown is that by using flipped learning, your content becomes much more easily accessed by your learners, but it also puts your students. They control how they access it, when they access it, how many times they access it, which is very powerful in terms of student learning, but also encouraging self-regulation or self-regulated learning. There's also a growing body of evidence that shows that flipped learning has a positive impact on student learning. I myself have seen that. Oh, I'm just getting a sorry, I know I'm getting some messages that my Wi-Fi still is bad. So if I'm cutting in and out, I apologize. Let me know. And I have everything shut down other than this. So hopefully it clears up, but let me know if it does continue. I apologize for that. So what I've seen in my teaching practice in terms of implementing flipped learning is that we were seeing students, have a much deeper content mastery, but they were also able to solve problems a lot more easily than students who had taken the courses when they were offered in a much more traditional format. The one thing that has been echoed by a lot of people who have selected or who have chosen to do flipped learning in terms of their practice is that you need to start small. I can't emphasize this enough. When I talk with people who say, okay, well, I want to flip my course, the last thing you want to do is flip the entire thing at once because it's a lot of different there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it. There's a lot of kind of more work at the beginning of it because it's a new thing. It's new for you. It's new for your students. So really giving yourself the time to start small, select one aspect of your course, work on that, and then add different units as time goes on. That's how I did that. I flipped my course over the span of a few years, starting small and adding additional units as I went along. What I really like, and this comes from Bergman and Sams, who really were some of the pioneers in terms of flipped learning. They introduced that in STEM contexts at the high school level, is they are really big proponents of flipped learning facilitating mastery learning, and that's been found in a number of additional studies as well since that time. What other researchers have shown is that students become more open to cooperative and innovative teaching strategies, and I'll speak to that a little bit later again. And it's really, as Neil said earlier, it's really asking you to flip your approach to teaching and learning. So it's a different way of thinking about how to prepare class and how to interact with your students throughout the course. The thing that that's important to think about when you're looking at flipping your course is it's really asking you to focus on the pedagogy a little bit in terms of how you're going to arrange the different components of your course. How can you use that to build community, but also, more importantly, how can you use this to build a very safe, collaborative space for your students? What I found in my own practice, as has been the case in the literature, is that it's really important to intentionally align your assessment, so anything that's done online, to the course learning outcomes, so that students know, okay, well, this is why I'm being asked to do certain things at home, either before coming to class face-to-face or, you know, in an online setting, as we're currently working through right now. The other, the last 2 points here have come from my practice, but also from the practice of others, is that we found it really helpful to break down the course into chunks or modules, where each of those chunks and modules have their own learning outcomes that are tied to the overall course learning outcomes, and that there's clear alignment between the two, so that we're very transparent with our learners, letting them know, okay, this is what we're going to focus on in this particular chunk or module. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to be working together to accomplish these goals together. And doing that really helps us leverage both synchronous and asynchronous activities within the course, and really think about what students can do offline and why we would consider asking students to do different types of activities offline as well. Now, I want to speak a little bit about these different principles, and I know they're getting old. I know this is from 1991, but they really speak very well to flipped learning. And I think flipped learning really allows us to integrate these within our practice and start to think about how these different principles of effective teaching and learning can be implemented in different ways. So what I found is that flipped learning really allows us to encourage interaction between students and faculty. In a flipped lesson, what you're doing is, when you're coming together either online or in person, you're coming together to work together. So you're going to be working on problem sets. You're going to be discussing different aspects of a piece of content or a chapter. So those interactions are a lot more emphasized than they would be in a traditional setting. It also encourages interactions between students. So you don't have to do this within your flipped class, but a lot of times what we see is that flipped classrooms or flipped learning is integrated within courses along with team-based learning. This is something that I've done in my own practice, and it really helps students to start to rely on one another, to teach one another, to work together on different problems as they're working through the different learning outcomes, sharing thoughts, sharing questions, helping each other throughout the term. Number 3 is, of course, utilizing active learning strategies. So there's a number of different ways in which you can integrate that within a flipped lesson, and we're going to give lots of examples today through the course of this workshop. And please feel free to ask questions at any point throughout the workshop today. It also allows us to provide prompt and useful feedback to our learners. So you can do that through your LMS system when students are submitting different pieces of assessments online. You can do that also if you're face-to-face. As Neil said, I'm also very big proponent of being optimistic that hopefully we can come back together face-to-face in September. But when you're having students turn in something in class, or simply walking around the room as they're working on a problem saying, you know what, let's talk about this question. Let me give you some feedback. Let me help you in terms of the different strategies you might be using as you're solving this particular problem. It also emphasizes time on task. One of the things that my studies on flipped learning has shown, as well as others, is that students, one of the comments that students keep sharing with us is that I have finally learned how to learn. So they have figured out, okay, well, I need to start thinking about my time management. I need to start figuring out, well, how am I going to approach the context? What am I going to do? How do I learn best? What do I need to do to learn the different material? So, and part of that is really this reliance on self-regulated learning strategies that has really been coming up to the forefront as we're thinking about and implementing flipped learning in different contexts. It also allows us to set very high expectations. So when you're looking at the different assessments you're asking your students to complete, being upfront and saying, you know what, these are the learning outcomes I want you to be able to meet by completing this assessment, and this is how we're going to do this. So it's really letting the students know this is what you're asking them to do, these are the reasons you're asking them to do this, and also letting them know that you're there. You're going to be helping them through this so that we are coming on the other end successfully. The last point is particularly near and dear to my heart, is that it respects diversity in ways of learning. By allowing students to deciding how they want to interact with the content, when they want to interact with the content, how many times they're going to go through the content, it's really allowing them to select the ways that work best for them. And I'll turn it over to Neil.
Great, thank you, Isabel. So quite a bit to unpack there. So thinking about that, let's take a moment and let's see if we can get a little bit of conversation happening, either through the chat or feel free to unmute your mic to share your thoughts. So what are your initial thoughts so far on the flipped learning model for the online environment? Are there any concerns, benefits, questions? Feel free to type in the chat or again, unmute your mic. Feel free to speak into it. So the 7 principles are getting some love there from Erica. Absolutely. And then Sherry commenting on loving the potential of the flipped classroom. So that's an interesting concern there from James. Unreliable online, or sorry, Jean, unreliable online resources. I think we really have to be careful, right, of what we want, what we're sharing our students, what resources we're giving our students, and then resources that the students are taking upon themselves to look up when completing any sort of learning activity. So I think that's a legitimate concern and something that we surely want to be aware of. So Zareen, that list came up on the previous slide there, the principles. I'd like to see what activities you can use in a flipped online class. I'm so glad, Chitra, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, that you commented that, because Isabel has some great activities lined up for us here shortly. So you made it feel much more approachable by encouraging a conversion from one lesson at a time. Yeah, Christine, and thank you for illustrating that point, Isabel, because I think that's a really important takeaway, right? If we're brand new to using this flipped classroom approach, we certainly don't want to try to do it all in one shot. Baby steps, right? One piece at a time, one lesson at a time. Good point there from Jennifer. Use the resources that we have at our institution. If we're concerned with resources or need help, of course, those resources, I'm surely at St. Clair College, and I'm assuming certainly at U Windsor as well, those resources are available to us as faculty. Okay, perfect. So I think we'll move on. Some good conversations there in the chat. And feel free to keep making use of the chat, keep the conversation going. I'll do my best to moderate as we go through.
Great. And we're going to try to also address a lot of these great points that you're putting into the chat throughout our workshop today as well. And if we miss something, please let us know so that we can definitely answer those questions and thoughts that you're putting in, which are great. That I wanted to really emphasize as we're getting ready to really unpack this idea of flipped learning a little bit more is this idea of flow. And what I really want to emphasize here when I'm talking about flow is the idea of alignment and really being upfront with your students and letting them know, why you're going to, first of all, be implementing flipped learning into your course. What is it going to look like? What are the things that are they going to be asked to do at home? How is that going to connect to the things they're going to be doing in class? And how is that going to connect to those final exams or those, high, kind of higher weighted exams that students think about quite a bit in our courses as they try to plan out their schedule and their study time. I want to take a minute or two just to give everyone a brief overview of what a traditional versus a flipped class looks like. So in the traditional class, and this is again very generalized, before I get into this is very generalized, but when we look at the traditional class, we're thinking about bringing our students together in a classroom setting. You're delivering content to them during that time. Asked to go home and complete various homework activities on their own. In the flipped class, you're essentially flipping that. So what you're asking your students to do is to spend time at home going through the content, and the content could be delivered to your students via, podcasts, via asking them to, read a portion of the text you've put on the LMS, watch a movie. There's a number of different ways in which content can be delivered, but you're really looking at students going through that content on their own at home before coming together, where you're going to be asking them to work together on various classroom activities that will allow them to apply their knowledge and make meaning of that particular content. So, of course, this particular schematic applies to a face-to-face type of setting, but what I will be trying to convey today as well is how you can do this in an online setting as well. So if we look first at the anatomy of an online, main portions of an online course. There are the asynchronous portions, which is really where our students are interacting mainly individually on their own time with the course content through the LMS system. The synchronous portion really is dedicated to asking our learners to come together as a group at specific times where we can discuss together different aspects of the content, work together on different problems, different questions, different scenarios, and start to kind of have that, that opportunity to make meaning of the content together. So if we focus a little bit more on online class, and dig a little bit deeper in terms of what types of activities can you offer in online classes? Well, there's two main types. Of course, it's the online activities that, those are the ones that come to mind, of course, first in an online setting. So asking students to complete an assignment, to complete a quiz via our LMS system. But there's also offline activities that sometimes we don't think about. So offline activities can involve asking our students to go outside or go inside their house and collect something. We had an amazing experience in my department this fall where we actually sent kits for students to collect insects. So yes, the course is online, but students would actually go outside, collect insects, and study them. So there's a number of different ways in which we can integrate offline activities, so activities where students are not attached to the computer to complete them within our online classes. And flipped learning can really help us think about that as we're planning our course and how to deliver it and engage with our learners. So going back to our Flix model, I wanted to go through the different components of the model and talk about how this helps us get to that red star in the middle, which is the meaningful learning. So when we think about a course, there's three main pieces of it. So the first bubble or piece of our model is the content or that information transfer. And when we think about content or information transfer, we're looking at readings, we're looking at podcasts, we're looking at a number of different things. The list there is really not meant to be, exhaustive in terms of the ways in which you can deliver content to your learners. The second bubble has to do with application or sense making. So these types of activities include things like self-tests, group discussions, problem sets, individual assignments, and simulations. Again, the list is not exhaustive here in terms of the ways in which you can ask your learners to make meaning of that content. The third component is engagement with both the course, but also with their peers. So we're looking at community building, feedback. So feedback in terms of to the students, but feedback to the instructor. We could also have peer feedback built into this as well, participation and motivation. What we have found really important in studying Flip, under what parameters or under what context can we create an environment where flipped learning in online courses will be successful is when these three bubbles overlap. So at that very middle point where you see the red star there. And you're really only going to get to that overlap of content, application, and engagement when you have alignment and when that alignment is very clear to your learner. So when you are very transparent about why you're asking them to do certain things and how those particular things, whatever those application activities or engagement activities you're asking your students to complete, how are those things going to help them learn that material and successfully reach the learning outcomes you've laid out for the course in your context? Neil, yes.
Thanks, Isabel. Just some really good conversations happening in the chat. A question from Jill regarding the model. Is it your work or does it come from somewhere else? I know we have references at the end coming.
Good question. It's actually a little bit of both. So we've been working together on trying to analyze the context of flipped learning across disciplines. So the model is part of that work. It's also the product of a very in-depth literature review that we're almost done kind of making. So that should be out in the next couple of months. Mm-hmm. Question. This is great. So keep the questions coming. So this model we kind of show it here in online courses. We see it also working very much in face-to-face flipped learning courses as well. What I wanted to do now is give you a bit of an example of how this can be implemented in an online course. So I'm going to be speaking about a course called Biology 331, which is a course I used to teach at the University of Calgary. This is a very high enrollment course. We're looking at anywhere between 400 to 500 students in any given term. It tends to be viewed by students as a memory intensive, content heavy course coming into that particular setting. It's also a course that students who are part of the biological sciences program, they have to take in order to be able to graduate with that particular degree. So I started teaching this course a couple of years ago. This is the second course that I fully flipped at the University of Calgary. And again, I was brought into the course to do just that, is to actually flip it. And what we've seen in terms of that course is that it was really hard in a traditional setting or in a traditional context to get students engaged. They would quickly become nervous and overwhelmed with the content, and just generally they were unsure about how to navigate through the content and how to start making connections between different pieces of the content and really get to that deep learning we wanted them to be able to get to. So what we did is we essentially looked at the entirety of the curriculum and split it up into 8 different modules that you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen. So, of course, this is a very biological setting. We've used the same strategy in arts contexts as well, and are seeing the same level of success. So what we were trying to do in creating those modules is essentially chunk the content into areas that would make it a little bit more manageable for students to understand, but would also allow them to more easily make linkages between modules so that they could achieve those more global course learning outcomes we wanted them to be able to achieve by the end of the course. Now, the thing that we decided to do with that course is we did use a team-based learning approach in addition to flipped learning. So to really get our students used to this particular model, we take the first week to allow students to get used to the course and to the technique and strategies we're going to be using to learn about biology together throughout the term. So essentially the first thing we do is we record a welcome video, so welcome message that's on our LMS. That is the first thing that students see. They get to introduce to the entire teaching team who we are, why we're excited to be here, and what it's going to look like working together in the term. I'm a huge fan of graphic course syllabi, so we actually have a 1-page kind of flow chart where we show our students what we're going to be doing this term, what the workload is going to look like, when things are going to be due, and we give them ungraded assignments in week 1 to get them used to the types of assessments, the types of activities they're going to be invited to participate in throughout the term. So what I want to do, actually, sorry, before I get to that, to the module, one last point about the teams, because I know this is a question that comes up fairly often. I assign students to teams. I know there's a lot of debate in the literature in terms of whether teams that are assigned are better than teams that are chosen by the students, and there's no clear winner in the literature in terms of which approach is best. What I've seen in my own practice is that I tend to have less students coming to me with complaints about teams if I put students in teams than if they pick their friends. So what I've done is I work with someone in psychology in Calgary, and he came up with a piece of software called ITP Metrics, and I'm going to put it in the chat here. This is a free tool that's available online, where students are asked to fill out a short survey, and the algorithm that's part of the tool will put students in teams on the basis of their answers to a number of questions, which you can choose. So one of the main factors that tends to drive the formation of very strong teams is whether the students are extroverts, introverts, or ambiverts. There's a number of different things you can put in there, but in my experience over the last 10 years, I typically have about 150 to 175 teams per term. I typically have 1 to 2 teams a term that don't work out of that amount after I started using ITP Metrics. So it does work quite well. So as part of the first week, to get them used to working in teams, we do a team contract, which I'm going to speak about in a few minutes, and I can share that team contract with everyone at the end. We have some resources we can email out if there's interest to see those particular documents. So that's really the first week, where we're essentially just giving students time to get used to what it's going to look like, how we're going to work together, and ask and answer questions about our particular procedure or our strategy in the course. So I'm going to unpack the first module just to let you know kind of what it looks like a little bit in terms of a STEM context. So in the first module, or in any module, I really start with laying out my learning outcomes, saying, okay, this is what we're going to focus on and why. I then have a number of activities, and I have them as step 1, step 2, step 3 in my LMS, so that students know, the order in which they should be going through the different portions of the module to help support their learning. So it's either a podcast or a summary document of the podcast. So depending on the student, some students really like to listen to a podcast, others like to read the information instead. Some like to do both. So again, in the spirit of trying to get students to be in the driver's seat, I like to give them as many different ways in which they can interact with the content. Because I use team-based learning, I then follow that up with what's called a readiness assessment quiz. So those are the 2-stage exams where we ask students to complete the quiz individually. And then after that, they complete the same quiz as a team. That's followed by what I call a team application activity. So this would be where we bring students together synchronously and they work in a team on a problem set that is really giving them the opportunity to make meaning and to extend their knowledge. Take what they've learned at home by looking at the podcast or reading a number of documents and really start to pull those pieces together and extend their knowledge, apply that knowledge to a new setting. In this particular course, we have weekly tutorials as well, which provided us with an additional opportunity to give our students another chance to again make meaning by tackling more problem sets together in their teams where they can ask questions, they can get help from graduate teaching assistants and really get feedback in terms of where are they at in terms of their understanding, in terms of their achievement of those learning outcomes. Do they have to go back and review anything, or are they, is their understanding sufficient to meet those particular outcomes? So as you can see in terms of the activities, what I really want to emphasize here is that we have asynchronous online and offline opportunities. So looking at podcasts and reading, but there's also synchronous online and offline, looking at teamwork. So when we're looking at the application activities, so students will, get together in a number of different ways, depending on the context and depending on the course. So I wanted to share with you an example of a podcast. This podcast I created for my biochemistry course. So this was the first course that I flipped. I'm not going to show the whole thing to you because it's 6 minutes. I'm just going to show you a few pieces of it. This is a podcast that I created using Camtasia. It's one of the tools you can use to make podcasts, but there's a lot of different tools you can use as well. A couple of things I want to emphasize about the podcast. Again, I start up with the learning outcomes, being very clear about what students are expected to be able to do by the end of that podcast. But I also put in the podcast different activities, different little assignments or practice questions they can work on so that they can self-assess their knowledge as they're preparing for the team-based activities that are synchronous. So I start off this. See. Now, what I want to emphasize, so I like Camtasia because I'm a big tablet user and I can basically kind of go through, highlight different chemistry oriented because this is a biochemistry course, but I could actually write on my slides and students, based on their feedback, really enjoyed that in terms of being able to follow along as I kind of derived these different structures, how to write and how to draw. And what I want to show you here, sorry, it's just coming. So they have time to practice. So here they're being given the opportunity to do the same thing on a different sugar. And I put the answer on the LMS system so that they can actually compare what they got to the answer key. And then before the next class, they're asked to do these things. So to actually draw a different type of sugar and then complete an online quiz on carbohydrates before coming together and working on the team-based assignment. So the next question people sometimes have with flipped courses is it going to at any point influence the rigor of my class or really change the way in which I assess my students, that would result, again, in less rigor as I'm evaluating students. And what I really want to emphasize here is no. So, so I've done this for over 10 years now, and being very mindful of studying what we were seeing and comparing what we were seeing to traditional classrooms, but also comparing what we were seeing with classrooms across North America, but also in Australia, who we had partnered with in terms of using similar strategies. So this particular course, although it was a fully flipped online course, has very similar components to a traditional course. So there's a few, of course, differences. So the first difference is, of course, we've got these in-class team application activities. So those were 13%. And this is what students would be invited to participate in when they would come together synchronously to make meaning. We also had peer evaluation. So we would ask our students to evaluate the contributions of their peers halfway through the term, but also at the end of the term, to really ensure accountability in terms of our students and their participation in teamwork. We also had team contracts. And this is reflected in one of our course learning outcomes that I've shared with you at the top of the screen, where one of our course learning outcomes was to work effectively in diverse teams and provide constructive peer feedback to teammates. We had a number of online quizzes, and you can see that, you know, these team application activities, these online quizzes, we had multiple. So these were intentionally low stakes to invite and encourage students to try and not so much be afraid of losing grades, making mistakes and losing grades and affecting their final standing in the course. Most of the students who are taking this course have eyes on applying to professional schools like medicine, where GPA is very, very important. So we really wanted to encourage them to try and not have so much of that fear of grades. We had tutorial assignments again, so those were worth 1% to 2% each. And we still had the midterm exam and the final exam, albeit the format of both was written as opposed to multiple choice, that we had, again, alignment with the types of problem sets that we were asking our students to complete in class and in tutorials. So I want to touch very briefly on the contracts. So the contract assignment has two key portions to it. So the students are first asked to complete a personal worksheet where they're asked to engage in self-reflection. So where they're going to be invited to think about what do they want to get out of the course, what do they have to offer to their teammates, and to be very honest about their personal preferences and work styles. And there's a number of different discussion questions that come with the worksheet, and I'm happy to share those with everyone at the end of the workshop. We can send that to you by email, but it's really a way of encouraging students to get to know each other and to have very frank discussions about their expectations and how they want to work together. The contract has a number of different portions to it, where teams are invited to set their learning goals and how they're going to assess their learning goals at the end of term. They are asked to share each other's strengths, so what each team member brings as a strength to the team, procedures they're going to use. So how are they going to decide on an answer? How are they going to communicate with one another? Team participation, and consequences for not following the contract. And the consequences, students are told, it can't just be running to me right away. I really want them to start looking at conflict resolution. How can they talk with one another to resolve conflict before coming to me? A lot of the things I would see are things like, okay, if I don't do my reading for a class, I'm going to buy everyone a cup of coffee from Tim Hortons, or bring Timbits. So when we were in class, I could see sometimes, like, you know, trays of coffee suddenly appearing, and then I would see teammates kind of start laughing. So there were ways in which they could, you know, learn to work together effectively and to handle conflict. So that was working quite well. Yeah, you say donuts, totally anything. So that was definitely something that I've also seen in the past. A few words about the LMS system. So again, I really encourage you to consider splitting up your course into different modules or units. So I have an example of what the LMS system looked like for the Biology 331. So this one was a tutorial module. So of course you can see it had step 1. So basically this is where they're starting, and there was the set of learning outcomes that we're going to be tackling in that particular module. And really ensuring that your learning outcomes align with your activities and that the timelines are very clear. And I think that becomes much more important in the online setting where we're not meeting with our students as frequently as we can, so that students know, okay, well, this is when stuff is due. This is how I'm going to have to organize my time to make sure that that I get these things done. So we want to give you the opportunity to think very quickly about creating your own flip lesson. And we're going to be inviting you to do so with a topic that is really not with anyone's disciplines, really, so that we can start thinking more about strategy as opposed to content. And the flip lesson you're going to be invited to think about is how to use the rule of thirds. So this is something that I just learned, you know, a few years ago from my colleague Patrick in Calgary. So he's a very avid photographer, and the rule of thirds means that you should essentially align different pieces of or different elements of your photo along these different grid lines that you see on the right hand side of the screen. So you should have this alignment, and it's supposed to be more aesthetically pleasing when you have that alignment as opposed to when you don't have it. So what we're going to be inviting you to do is to plan a flip online module for teaching students this rule of thirds. So essentially the outcome should be students should be able to compose a picture by using the rule of thirds. So we're going to invite you to use the chat and put in some thoughts and some suggestions for things in terms of content, activities, and assessment that you would put into the asynchronous portion of the online course, the synchronous portion, and offline portion. So what types of activities could you put into these different pieces of the course? And feel free to take the mic or put it in the chat, whatever is most comfortable for you.
Probably the first thing that comes to my mind is the offline, just take a whole bunch of pictures. It's a good place to start.
Exactly. To just think this is hard. Asynchronous. So Jennifer saying choose their own pick and put it on a grid. Absolutely. Watch a video asynchronously. Absolutely. Synchronous, share and discuss photos. Absolutely. You could have like a series of different photos and compare them. That's awesome. Lots of great thoughts coming in here now. Watch a video asynchronously. Find examples of rule of thirds. Absolutely. So basically which ones follow it, which ones don't. Yeah, why, when to follow by Maris. Put a grid on top of each photo that they take. Absolutely. Take selfies. Absolutely. And use the rule. Erica's mentioning rating or evaluating existing photos. Absolutely. So you can see that there's lots of amazing thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing those. And what we're really wanting you to think about when you're thinking about this module is that, yes, at the beginning, it kind of feels like, how am I going to do this? It's a very normal sort of reaction. But when you start thinking about, well, what is it that my students, what do I want my students to be able to do? Like Barbie Honeycutt's quote said, and then thinking backwards, that backwards design model, but applied in a flipped learning setting, looking at, okay, well, how am I going to get there? What do my students need to know before they hit that synchronous session where they can actually then come together and make meaning? And I'll turn it over to Neil.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so some common challenges with flipped learning, and those of us who tried to implement some sort of flipped learning in our classes before, I'm sure can speak to a lot of these points. Student resistance, I think that's number one for a good reason. I know myself, speaking from personal experience, I've experienced a lot of resistance on the student side, and myself as a student resisted quite a bit, and certainly my peers would resist as well. But hopefully students would begin to appreciate the learning process and see that it is helping them retain the information in this kind of participatory process. Certainly students fear about grades. Speaking to student resistance, student fears with grades, student anxiety, for many of these students, this is really charting perhaps into unknown territory. So I think this might be where a lot of the anxiety comes from. So I think there'd be a lot of those calming the waters, so to speak, on the behalf of the professor. Planning ahead, of course, with the flipped online model, we're asking the students to do quite a bit of work outside of the classroom so they're prepared for our in-person or online synchronous class. So they have to do that work. And I know when one of the first courses that I've taught, I had grand, ambitious plans to flip the classroom. Very simple learning exercise. It was essentially do the reading. Do the reading and come to class prepared to discuss. Really easy. I didn't want to do a lecture. I wanted them to have that lecture, so to speak, through the reading, and then we can talk about it in class. And then early on, of course, there was silence, no discussion happening within the class, dead air, so to speak. So, I mean, that's something that we may have to confront when we adopt this flipped online model. Speaking from my experience, it was really easy to just give those students some refining questions instead of just do the reading. Instead, there was a list of questions and a kind of a checklist of sorts for them to keep in their mind as they were doing that reading. And then the discussion was much more productive when we had that synchronous class. But we do have to plan for that. We do have to plan ahead, and it's quite a bit of work, not only for the students, but for the instructors as well, to orchestrate appropriate, asynchronous activities for the students to complete so we get more out of the class. And it can produce anxiety, not only for students, but to ourselves as well. My fear was having a discussion with no discussion, and that fear was realized. So it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, right? So we want to make sure we do the prep beforehand, and then perhaps have a plan B in mind, just in case it doesn't go according to plan. When we add the layer of online challenges, this presents kind of a whole new can of worms. When students are new to the online space, and then the instructor is new to the online space, that can be very anxious, cause a lot of anxiety as well, right? So basically, we want to make sure we play around as instructors. We play with the technology, we play with the online space, and kind of calm those fears before actually presenting the material to the class. Continuing on with common challenges, finding online resources. It was mentioned in the chat. We want to make sure that those are good resources, but it can be a challenge to find those good resources that we want to apply for our students. In particular, when we talk about simulation, I know speaking for St. Clair College folks, we tend to want to find resources that really mimic the industry, the work environment, and that can be a challenge to find those resources. We want to plan well-structured online activities that promote student engagement. Yeah, this has been a big problem over the past few semesters, the student engagement in the online space. Really easy for students to turn off their mic, turn off their camera, and who knows what they're doing on the other end. My guess they're probably sleeping or napping in a lot of cases. We want to have little tricks to engage those students when we're teaching that online. Even a simple poll, simple, hey, type in the chat, how are you feeling, check-in time, these sorts of activities. And when we talk about asynchronous, that produces a lot of challenges if we want them to add to a discussion board. We want them to comment on a video. Things of this nature, in many cases, speaking from my experience, it helps to have a carrot at the end of the stick. So if it works for your course outline, having some assessment pieces built in there and that can kind of help sell these activities. I'd love to tell you that if you tell students that they learn, and that should be enough of a reward for them by participating in the activities, sometimes that doesn't always work. So students can police each other. This can be used to good effect. I was just at an earlier PD session earlier today, and the facilitator did a tremendous job of creating discussion boards, Q&A discussion boards, and encouraging students to comment on those Q&A boards. Right, so that can be both good, but could also potentially bad if it kind of gets away from you. All right, so you do want to make sure you're as the professor, you're kind of monitoring some of these activities in the offline space. Anything to add there, Isabel? Anything that I'm missing there?
No, that's great. Maybe I'll just add one quick point on the policing each other piece. What we found in our research, so we do ask. We use team-based learning in our class, and we ask our students to peer assess and to come up with these team contracts. We found that to be effective in reducing the anxiety students had about working in teams. One of the things we found in our focus group interviews with students is that students often told us things like they were motivated to ensure they were ready because they didn't want to let their. So it started to create the community piece, which was really nice. And a lot of students were saying, I didn't know anyone in class. And with the teams, I was able to rely on my peers for information, to even just to talk. I found that particularly the case in the winter when we pivoted online very rapidly. It gave them community when they necessarily would not have had community otherwise. So there's good and bad, and I think it's really a matter of being transparent in terms of how you put this into place and being very open to conversation with your students. Couple of last points. We've talked about this a little bit before, but I just wanted to touch on these. So again, when you're thinking about assessment, really being intentional about the things you're asking your students to complete so that it's a value add to their learning and it's not a just for grade or make work project, because that engagement is going to go really down quickly, and it's not going to really be seen as meaningful for their learning. Really thinking about using a variety of assessments, and I think that's the nice thing about flipped learning is that you can have online quizzes, you can have team assignments, and you can really build in opportunities to give both formative and summative feedback throughout the term. It also allows you to make student learning and accountability visible, so that frequent and small approach with frequent feedback from Talbert that he talks about. This idea also of co-creating rubrics with students, I really like that. It provides students with an opportunity for reflection, but an opportunity to become partners in learning, and you get more buy-in in terms of them coming on board with flipped learning. I posted an article a few minutes ago that speaks to resistance from students when they're invited to enter into an active learning environment. And they really talk about this concept called expectancy value theory, and how it's applied to active learning. So I would really encourage you to have a look at that. It's done really, really well. And a few tips for success that I've found over the last few years is if you are going to use team-based learning is to create your groups early. So I do that in week 1 and I keep the groups together throughout the term. I really am intentional about scaffolding the group work process so that they can get used to working together in very low stakes environments and assessments at the beginning, and then they start to go up as the term goes on. I provide team building activities early in the course, so I get them to come up with a team name. They create little selfies where they actually paste each other's heads kind of on a photo, which has worked really well. They do all sorts of really cool creative things that way. I communicate expectations early, using low stakes online quizzes as motivation and feedback, really important. And I use a grading scale for team projects. I myself, as part of my teaching philosophy, is I want to reward trying. And I found that a lot of my students are afraid to try because they're afraid to be wrong and to lose marks. So I want to reward the process, not just the final answer. So what I did do is those synchronous team projects, if they get 80%, they get an A. So it's encouraging them to try, it's encouraging them to engage in conversation that will help their learning and not just be focused on the end product. Last little bit in terms of creating videos or podcasts, there's been a few points throughout about, it's hard. It can be really hard to create resources. But the thing I want to emphasize is that you don't have to create all of your own resources. So yes, I use Camtasia to make mine, but you don't have to. There's a lot of content that's available online, either through textbook publishers. There's some really good TED Talks. Khan Academy is also really good. There's one site I love. It's called Merlot. And Merlot is actually peer reviewed, and there's really good resources for all contexts and all content areas on there. It's amazing. The one thing that research has found is that any kind of podcast should be kept to a single topic in a short amount of time, so less than 10 minutes. And so the third point I had to learn the hard way. I wish I could go back in time 10 years ago and tell myself, don't sweat the details so much. I used to re-record myself probably like 15 times because I would count the number of ums and I'd be mortified. So did I really sound that way? Or my cats would like howl in the background or whatnot. It really doesn't matter. My cat's meowing or howling sometimes was the highlight. I have students emailing me going, we heard your cat. And it was like, a highlight. So it doesn't have to be perfect. There's been a number of studies that have shown that the degree of learning in terms of having students listen to a homemade podcast versus a professional podcast, there is absolutely no difference between the two. I have a number of colleagues who actually use videos where they know there's an error in it, and they actually ask students, well, what's the mistake in that particular video? So it actually gives them a chance to really think through the different content piece and really try to figure out, well, what's wrong here and how could I fix it? So, there's a number of different things you can do, but again, knowing that you don't have to make everything and it doesn't have to be perfect were things that I would love to have really realized when I started down this road a number of years ago. So in summary, in terms of next step, we're really wanting to invite you to flip your thinking and focus on what students need to do, and looking, specifically at how can you align your content and activities to your course learning outcomes, being intentional, important, and using that technology meaningfully. It doesn't have to always be podcasts and videos. It could be a reading. It could be, your journal article, could be a blog. There's a number of different things you can use. It doesn't have to just be the podcast. So we've got a number of references here. We'll be sending this out to everybody after this, and number of websites that are really good in terms of giving you more information. To thank you for coming and for having this great discussion with us about flipped learning today. And we'd really like to open the floor to any questions and suggestions and thoughts you may have. Oh, there's a hand. Let me just see here. Chitra.
Yeah, hey, I was wondering, how do you guys deal with students, especially if you're doing teamwork in an online setting and you have a group contract and everything? If there is one student who persistently does not participate for whatever reason, it could be a legitimate reason, or it could just be like, I hate doing teamwork. How do you deal with that?
Good question. Neil, did you want to take that, or do you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I don't think there's any one solution, right? I mean, it really depends on a number of factors, really depends on the student. But I think it goes back to a lot of the points that you were saying earlier, Isabel, is trying to foster the sense of community within the class, trying to ensure that your classroom activities are aligned with the course outline, the syllabus, and they're aligned with the students' future ambitions are. So in particular at the college level, we tie that in. Hey, why are you here? What's that dream job you're trying to land? And you could certainly apply that at the university level as well, right? What's their ambition, and then kind of tie that in. Hopefully, it's an easy tie-in with the activity that you want them to achieve. So that's usually my approach. I kind of think of, okay, what does a student want to accomplish, and then try to tie that in with my rationale for them to complete the activity.
Well said. Yeah, same kind of strategy. For us, with what we, the 2 times where they would give each other feedback. So we would actually have a little module on how to give proper feedback, but also how to receive feedback from peers, how to read it, how to take it. And we would assign a grade to that. And if the student, we would, and this very rarely happened, I think I've done this once in the last 10 years, we would have a way to change the weighting of the group work so that the students wouldn't others if they had not contributed without having some kind of reason for not having done that. Great question. Dave.
Oh, thanks very much, Isabel and Neil, for a really a good workshop. And my question is, and it struck me this in the fall, I've always used a number of assessments through courses and broken things down low stakes as possible. And when I flipped my classroom, I didn't really change anything in that regard, but everybody else did. And so one of the #1 complaints that I had with this kind of approach is that if a student is in 5 courses and everybody's doing this, they're exhausted. They can't keep up. There's just so much assessment going on that they don't have time for that deep learning, because they find that they're particularly in first year when they're just learning how to manage their time, etc. So I thought I would ask you how what you think about that. And there seems to be a trend now, and particularly with online learning, to assess way more than and perhaps over assess.
Great point. I completely agree. I think we definitely have to be very asking our students to do things differently. And I always tell my students when we start in week 1, I am changing that unwritten contract of, I'm not going to stand there and just deliver content and ask you to go home and do things. And I think that's very important. And I agree. And I think, the approach that we've taken is really looking at how do we teach our students to be better self-regulated learners at the same time. And I think it's challenging. And I think you're absolutely right. And there's been a number of, reports over the last couple of months that students are overwhelmed. And I think, one of the is we've had things like, okay, we'll drop, the lowest assignment, or we'll, you can pick, complete X out of Y sort of kind of thing, so that they have some control over that. The other strategy that I've seen some instructors use is specifications grading, so that, depending on the level or the grade they want, they'll come of Y so that they get that. So so there's a number of different things we can do. Neil, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Dave, and I think that's a tough question to answer, right? I mean, I'm thinking from the perspective of faculty, even for us, it can become overwhelming with all of the marking that we're doing, not to mention from the students' perspective as well. So I know I encourage a lot of faculty to work with their program teams, to communicate with one another, have a good idea of what assessment pieces each are doing. So hopefully in that way you're not overburdening students. And one thing with the online space, perhaps sometimes anyways, with using Teams, it can make it a lot easier to communicate with your program team, with fellow colleagues, by just giving them a quick Teams chat, a video call, in absence of actually seeing them, down the hall in the office, right? So, I mean, that's along with what you said, Isabel. I would just emphasize, and Dave, I know you mentioned this too, just really communication is key, and maybe trying to come up with a plan, not just a plan for your course, but a plan for the program. How are you going to address some of these challenges? because certainly we don't want to overburden those students. And I agree 100%. In order to, at St. Clair College, a lot of faculty, in order to get our students more engaged, we are throwing assessments at them. You know, formative assessment, small piece, low stakes assessment. Hey, we got to get them participating. And yeah, that might work to engage the students, but certainly too much of that can be overwhelming.
May I say something?
Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. I agree with what Dave said, and I've got a couple of suggestions. I don't know if they're working that well with my class. I teach a seminar class, fourth-year seminar class, and the students have to give seminars. It saves me from having to lecture. But I found that if you put them in teams, so that the team is kind of graded as well as just the individual student, that seems to have some type of an incentive. But in in another class, which is a lower level class, we give students at the end of the week a quiz for each lecture as a topic, and we used to grade the quizzes, and that grade would be able to use that. They'd be able to bank those grades against anything they lost on their finals and their midterms. We have three unit tests and a final, and that didn't work very well at all. Students just decided they weren't going to take the quiz because they were upset about losing marks. So what we do is we give them the quiz and we say, we don't care what you get. We'll mark it and tell you why you got this question wrong. But every time you take the quiz, you get 3 points. So they have, say, 9 quizzes or 10 quizzes throughout the term, and they get 18 or how many points they get, 30 points or something like that. And that really helps them. And what we found last term is that they did much better on their tests. That we didn't have to use their participation points to up their grade, and that might work. I don't know. We haven't really empirically tested it, but we have a good feeling about it. The students seem to like it. But they had to show that they had taken the test. And they can take the test. They can look up the answers in the book and write. They can get them all right. Say, oh, gee, I don't think I got that wrong. And they look up the book. They can. In other words, we say, you can cheat if you want. Because you're going to get the grades anyway. You're going to get those 3 points anyway. I think that's kind of one way to do it. I don't know. What do you guys think, Neil? And what do you guys think?
I like that because, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Isabel, please.
What I like about it is it gives them the chance, kind of in a non-stressful environment, to try things, and even just the process of looking something up helps them kind of start to make meaning and start to really get engaged with that. So I think that's great.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, and it sounds like you kind of have a good pulse on the class, right? So I mean, if the students seem to be enjoying it, it must be working. As far as the workload, concerning the workload on the students' end, if they're having a good time, they're enjoying it, that's a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so unless there are any additional questions, thanks everyone for sticking around and participating in the session. It's much appreciated. Isabel, thank you so much for letting me to take along with you on this journey. It's much appreciated.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege. Thank you for the opportunity.